Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome, Kit Kat. So welcome to another episode of the Humans and Wildlife Show. I'm Dr. Georgia Terry. With me, as always, is my co-host, Dr. Christian Sase. Christian, what are we going to talk about? We have a little bit of an unusual treat for everyone.
Yes, hi Georgia. Very nice to see you again. And hi everyone. It's Wednesday. Yeah, today it's all about sound. It's things that we don't much think about. And I think we're very fortunate to go a bit into that. Of course, Georgia, you in your bat world have gone a lot into sound, and probably you are much more sensitive to sound than most of us are. And that's really what it is about. You know, it's so funny when I was playing this beautiful recording by Dr. Bernie Krause, what it is today. I was just hearing next door when they were doing the building. That's exactly what it is. We have so much sound interference, don't we? So,
Yeah, and so you mentioned Christian, Dr. Bernie Krause. So who is he?
yes, Dr. Bernie Krause is actually quite a celebrity. So he is an American musician and also a soundscape ecologist, and he's done a lot of great works starting in the 60s as quite a famous musician, and then went out because he couldn't see very well. It was very interesting. That's what this whole interview is about. And yes, it is a recording that we did 2 years ago, just before COVID. And it is absolutely intriguing because you will learn in this a lot about the importance of sound and how songbirds and everything else interacts with nature.
Yeah, and so some of the previous examples of how animals use sound, both from examples from previously that we've talked about in the show and just my own research. So, as many of you know, bats use echolocation to hunt insects. So, they basically send out their little sonar, and based on how the sound waves bounce back to them, they get information about where different barriers are basically in front of them. And they can translate that information into just like sort of a map of their surroundings. And we also talked a few episodes ago when we were talking about river dolphins. River dolphins and other species of dolphins also have an underwater sonar that they use, echolocation. So sound is very important for many animals as like a supplement to other senses for interacting in the world.
Yes, and especially in the marine world, we often forget that, right? You have all these vessels interfering with whales, with dolphins, and so on. And that's probably something we're going to touch on in a few episodes onwards from here. David Howden says, "My bat detector." That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great, yeah. And so, like, I mean, yeah, we talked about hunting, a couple examples. And often when people use bat detectors, yeah, what they're picking up is the hunting calls of the bats as they're flying around in the air. But I mean, sound is also important. Obviously, birds have songs like mating calls that they use. So they have specific songs to attract mates,
Mhm.
territorial calls found in bats and birds to, help warn others of the same species away from a particular area that they have claimed. So what do you say, Christian? Should we start
Yeah, let's
the
get
interview?
going, and I think you're going to find this really intriguing together with David Hancock. And since Bernie is completely focused on sound, and David completely focused on seeing, it's a very interesting conversation. So here we go.
My background is mostly in music, and let me just start at the beginning. Actually, before that, the reason I got into music is because I don't see very well. So my world is entirely informed by what I hear. And so music was a logical place to begin, certainly for my parents in the early 40s, when there was no other option except music as any kind of way of expression for me. And so I began with violin when I was 3 years old or 3.5, and began to study composition at 4. I studied with the first principal violinist of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, which at that point was a really classy organization and well supported. And Misha Mishakov was his name, and then I guess the hormones kicked in and I switched to guitar because it was a much more social instrument for me, and learned all styles. And when I applied to university when I was 15 years old, I applied to Juilliard and Eastman and all of the requisite schools that taught music. But I was told that guitar was not a musical instrument in the U.S. And this was 1955. Oh yeah. Oh, David has been like that ever since. And I was told I couldn't do it. Never mind that I had 300 years of guitar literature under my arm from every major composer. But guitar was not a musical instrument here. As a matter of fact, it wasn't taught in the U.S. until 1961, where it was introduced at Berklee School of Music in Boston, only as jazz repertoire. So I worked my way through school. Nevertheless, I was a fairly good guitarist, and I worked my way through school at University of Michigan, driving in, several times a week to Detroit to play guitar at Motown. And I did a lot of the early Motown sessions in the 1950s before it became a really big deal, and I made $5 a night, that kind of thing. After Michigan, I joined a group called the Weavers, and I replaced Pete Seeger in that group for their last year together in 1963. And then I came to California to study electronic music with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen.
What? Stockhausen? Good.
Yeah. And Pauline Cosera at Mills College. They were teaching there, and I learned the analog synthesizer. But I didn't like the synthesizer that was at Mills College, and I was introduced to a fellow by the name of Paul Beaver from Los Angeles, who was doing all the weird sound effects for, like great big movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon and stuff like that. And he had one of these theremins, an original version of Leon Theremin's 1929 invention. And together, Paul and I put together a pretty good team called Beaver and Krauss. And at the 1967 Monterey Pops Festival, we introduced the synthesizer to pop music and film. We sold to a lot of groups and like the Doors and Frank Zappa and so on. And we taught them how to play. We were on a lot of sessions for a lot of these groups. Mick Jagger, George Harrison, George Martin, the Beatles bought one from us. We sold a lot of instruments, but the problem was that the groups were too stoned to play it. So Paul and I all of a sudden had a lot of work, in the studio, and for quite a while we did very well. And we wrote the None Such Guide to Electronic Music, which is still a standard reference in that field. But to cut to the chase, our first album for Warner Brothers, which was actually our third album, but our first album for Warner Brothers was called In a Wild Sanctuary. And In a Wild Sanctuary it was released in 1970, but begun in 1968. And it was the first album on the theme of ecology. It was also, which we knew really nothing about, but had to do some serious reading, like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and so, which was really our introduction to this work and the influence for that particular album. But it required that either Paul or I go into the field to record. And Paul had no interest in doing that kind of thing. He was definitely a double-breasted suit, wingtip shoe, costumed guy. And the field was not the place for him. He was terrified of that. I was too, because I grew up in a family terrified of animals. We never had an animal in the house. And I just decided at that point I wanted to get over that fear. And so I marched off into what I thought was the wild, which was a local park north of San Francisco called Muir Woods. with lots of signage and well-paved, trails and so on. I was scared to death. And it was October. But I turned on the recorder, and because just at that point, stereo portable recorders were coming out, like the Ewer, the Nagra. And so with a pair of stereo mics and the Ewer, I went out to the field and to this park and turned on the recorder. And when I heard the sound, which was this incredible sense of space, through my headphones, I decided right then and there that was what I was going to do the rest of my life. I was going to figure out a way to do that. And so little by little, we were still doing a lot of music, a lot of films. We did 135 features with maybe 250 albums and so on. But that wasn't what interested me. What interested me was going out into the field in the spare time that I had to record natural soundscape. I kept going further and further afield as I got less and less afraid, to the point where I just wanted to go places where nobody would walk, and there was no trace of anybody, which is, of course, not true because there's traces of us everywhere. But in the 1960s and 70s, it really wasn't quite as bad, and there was a lot to record. And I began to capture. The way that I went about it was from a more holistic perspective than I had been taught. I was working with somebody David would know, Luis Baptista.
Yes. Definitely.
On his face, it changed immediately.
Yes.
I worked at the California Academy of Sciences with Luis, and of course, learning sound from that perspective, which was a much older perspective, was the bird by bird example, where you take the bird out of context and decontextualize the sounds of the natural world. Well, as a composer and a musician, that was really antithetical to the way I understood how sound operates. Sound operates as a collective, and we're all part of a larger soundscape, which is also part of Murray Schafer's work in Canada, that he's introduced in his book, Tuning of the World, which came out in 1977. So for me, whenever I went out into the field, I went out, of course, with Luis's parabolic dish, but I also went out with another recorder, and I never told him about this, and I would record the whole environment and capture the whole soundscape of the environment, because I was interested in how all the sounds fit in relationship to one another.
The ecology of the scape.
It's exactly right. And so my collection is interesting. The archive that I have is interesting only because it captures the history of the soundscape from the late 1960s to the present, and shows how many habitats have changed over time. 50% of my archive, well, actually more than 50% of my archive comes from habitats that no longer exist. They're either altogether silent, or they have, or the biophony, the collective sound that comes from all of the organisms in a given habitat at one time. The biophony has changed so radically that it would be unrecognizable if anybody ever went back. And these changes are due to human endeavor in the broader sense, like climate change, pollution, all kinds of issues that we know and talk about. But this is a wonderful example of how these things have changed. So I have this material, and I've used it, of course, for publications which are available, but also I wanted to find new ways of expressing this work. And so with Richard Blackford in the UK, I've written a symphony called the Great Animal Orchestra. And I've also written a ballet, a score for a ballet with the Alonzo King Lions Ballet in San Francisco, which is an international group. It's a really nice piece called Biophony. And I'm doing these art pieces mostly for the Fondation Cartier in Paris, which have been shown everywhere. Right now they're in Milan at the Triennale. and they'll run till September, and then on October 1st it opens on the Strand in London, and it'll run for 6 months. So anyway, that's a short history of my last 50 years.
Well, I want to jump in. First off, you gave me the perfect introduction. If you recognized you had a visual impairment, this is going to be an unusual thing. I got into this whole business because I had a sound impairment. I don't really hear things properly, and I tried getting into music and gave it up very quickly. I do appreciate the natural sound, but not as effectively, I think, as some people. And that's why I went into visual things with cameras. Though I just used to, in the 60s, I always carried an Agra with my film cameras. I always had an Agra, so I have some appreciation for this. But now I've gone back from the ecological perspective. Sound has become more important to me in this modified environment that we now live, and how today we can actually utilize those changes, the loss of these natural sounds seems to me to be something we are missing in using that loss as a tool to kind of define how things have been screwed up. We often have rules that say about not being able to disturb animals. But the thing that we don't define is how we can record in both a sound scape size way or on a sonograph. We don't use that at all anywhere that I can see in our ecological evaluation of how the world is deteriorating. We're not effectively using it. When I saw your material, I thought, how wonderful. You have all these wonderful sounds of every kind of community, but I'm not hearing enough about how that loss of sound or changes in sound can be effectively used as a tool by ecologists to seek mitigation for the loss.
Well, David, you bring up a lot of points in that. The first of which is your inability to hear is rectified now because we can see sound.
Exactly. That's what got me excited.
In the form of a spectrogram.
Exactly.
What got me excited about seeing them in the form of a spectrogram is, as a composer, I'm looking at the composition. And so you can see the composition in the spectrogram, and whether the composition expresses a healthy habitat or a habitat that's under stress. We can tell that. So if the habitat is under stress, we can then talk about ways to mitigate that stress. What do we do to do that? We understand that in a healthy habitat, the illustration shows a what do you call it? It shows a continuum of sound, a structure of sound that looks healthy. If it's and looks unstressed because because the individual sounds are not competing for acoustic space and acoustic territory. So that's why. I mean, that's the same way we do in a symphony. We try that each of the instruments stays out of the other's way so that you can hear each instrument individually if you need to.
You have to have 16 grasses, 7 herbs, and I mean, otherwise you don't have an ecology. I mean, you got to have soil. It's all the other components, the sound components.
Every animal is looking for acoustic bandwidth in which to vocalize. And so it has to find acoustic bandwidth that's unimpeded by others. So it's clear channel. So that's the whole idea that I came across when I was listening to this material and looking at it as spectrograms. And said, oh, geez, this is really interesting. And it looks like a musical score. It looks like something written by Boulez or even Murray Schafer. if you like. So that's what kind of got me into this thing. But basically, the reason that I do this is because it makes me feel good. I mean, I'm a strong believer in the Japanese Shinrin Yoku forest bathing idea and going into the forest and relaxing. I have a terrible case of ADHD, which I've had since I was a kid. And so the only thing that works, it wasn't drugs or anything like that that helped mitigate that. The only thing that helps me is going into a natural area and hearing the soundscape. And I go there for hours, and I'll sit there for hours just listening to this stuff. It calms me down. It centers me. It makes me quiet. I don't go, I'm not shuffling my feet. I'm not nervous. I'm just completely engaged in the natural world. And that's the main reason why I've done this. And all the other is ancillary. I've written music, I've published papers, and by the way, there are a lot of papers that I've written that talk about this mitigation issue.
Oh, are there? Okay. I have not seen them. Okay, so I'll have to research that.
On Research Geek, you can get them, and if you can't find them, email me.
Yeah.
Christian has mine.
Can we hone in on one aspect of that?
Yeah, and real quick, if Christian could pause it quickly.
Wow, like most places.
Yeah, so I did go and I looked up a few of his papers. Here's one using ecoacoustic methods to survey the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And here's an example of another one, just sort of an introduction to the field that Bernie did, Soundscape Ecology, the Science of Sound in the Landscape. And he also was co-author, I saw, on a very famous paper in Science, which I think it was called The Sound of Nature and the Nature of Sound. Oh, I forget now. But he has a lot, actually, a quite impressive repertoire of papers, which is quite cool. And then also a little bit before that, they were talking quite a bit about spectrographs. And so I just thought I'd show you a picture real quick of what that looks like. Let me go ahead and screen share. Can you see my screen now, Christian?
Yes. Yeah, here you go.
Yeah, and so this is an example of a spectrograph that was recorded last summer. And it actually has two or three different species of bats calling in it. And so on this y-axis here, up and down, is the frequency of the sound. And as we go along from left to right, we're seeing the time passes by, basically. And each of these little sort of continuous lines or swishes is a pulse of a bat call. So they're going when they do their hunting echolocations. And we can see here that we have one species way up here that is having a high frequency call. We have another species that's calling a little bit lower down. And then this third one that you can barely kind of see that's calling at an even lower frequency. And so that's what he means when he talks about they're kind of the different species sort of partitioning the different areas of the soundscape. They don't want to be competing with each other. They don't want to be shouting on top of the same frequency. And so they kind of have it, for various reasons, they have it, shifted so that the spectrograph has different calls. Does that make sense, Christian?
That's a beautiful example you have there. It's like a composition, where you have the bass and you have the treble, and the others are playing treble, the other ones with while the low ones are playing the bass. It's very nice. He said it's like it's like a composition. Really nice.
Yeah. And this is unfortunately not a great call file to do it because this program doesn't allow you to have multiple calls on top of it itself. So you see that it's only going to show the strongest sound at any point in time. So, when this louder species comes in, basically this other species starts to get cut out. But in reality, they're kind of all going at the same time in their respective little subdivisions of the frequency. So yeah, I just thought I would share that real quick.
Beautiful. And then let me just also share Bernie Krause's TED Talk. I'll put it in here. That's quite an impressive TED Talk.
We have a question from a Fit American from Twitch. Hello. first-time
Okay.
viewer. Yeah, we're talking, this episode is about sounds in nature, basically. And we have a bit of a previously recorded interview with Bernie Krause, who is a famous musician and also a well-known scientist, and who uses basically, one day he decided to go out and start recording sounds in nature. And it turns out you can figure out a lot if you just go out and record sounds in nature over time. You can hear, oh, the stream is making a lot less noise than it used to. There's the water levels are down. Oh, we don't hear as many insects now. Maybe the bug populations aren't as healthy as they used to be. So that kind of thing.
Exactly. So let's go on. 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen again.
Has some degree of protection. But in British Columbia, we have the British Columbia Wildlife Act, and it has one huge recognition in it, and that is, and it's specified, so different than any other creature or any other aspect. It defines the bald eagle's nest and the tree that holds the nest in specific clauses that give special protection and so on to the eagle, more so than almost to any other component. And one of the things that our present government is doing is trying to mitigate things that go to happen to degrade eagles and their habitat. And they're using these clauses that were put there so long ago, nobody even kind of remembers why they were put there, but they're there. And one of the things that I have been working on is trying to use these clauses to protect eagles. And once I started to look at your soundscapes and the sonographs, and particularly your frog thing, that really just jumped out to me. Because when you showed that wonderful meadow and the frogs and their synchrony of their sounds, and then there was a removal of a piece of forest, just a bit of removal. It wasn't even clear cut, it was the exact opposite. And the justification by the logger, if I remember, was, oh, I'm not going to clear cut, I'm just going to take a tree out here and one out there. And you showed the before and after, and you can't, to be honest, really see where the trees are missing. And yet your sound recording before and after, it took something like, it just totally changed the soundscape of your portrait of it when it was printed out. The second thing was, after frogs were into their sexual routines and with their synchrony of calling, when a single jet plane flew over, that's what really made it for me. It took, I think you said, 45 minutes for the frogs to get back into a synchrony of their calls. And that's what they have evolved, this way of claiming they are part of the soundscape that's for them as frogs. And before they got into that synchrony again of their calls, in that 45 minutes you inferred, and I assume there was some data behind this, that before the frogs got into a synchrony, they were individually making their calls and getting collectively better and more representative of the synchronous pattern. But in that 45 minutes, the predators, the horned owl, the coyote, could identify the individual sounds. But once they were in that harmonic thing, everything blended together, and it totally screwed up the horned owl and the coyote from finding them. But when they weren't yet in their synchrony, that has taken hundreds of thousands of years probably to evolve, they were vulnerable. And I think, my God, that just opened up a whole thought to me. I mean, I had not ever had that kind of an awareness. And I'm wondering if in our eagles, if we can somehow take out and find components where we can really show they're happy. I mean, that's one way of summarizing it, or they're being disrupted. And in the ways, in the prospect between these two things of happy and not. Is there ways that we can analyze this and show it and demonstrate it and use it in court cases?
You know something? Probably yes. And the reason I say that is when, and think of this analogy, when we've got a cold and we're sick, our voice changes. And that infirmity shows in our voice. When a habitat is sick, it shows in its voice, in the biophony. When an eagle is under stress, or any bird is under stress, it shows in their voice. If their voice is part of their survival behavior, it shows.
And it is, certainly.
All we have to do is find a way to arrive at a baseline from which to judge whether or not the eagle is whether it's just an anomaly of expression, which was what Luis Baptista was working on with white-crowned sparrow.
Yes, with his song sparrow, right, or white-crowned and song sparrow, yeah.
So, or whether or not it's truly a sign of infirmity, and so that we have to figure out. Problem now, more than anything, and I'm working with a couple of bioacousticians in Europe about this, in France and Italy, is that we can no longer rely on the idea of baseline.
Yeah, and so Christian just paused it again. It took me a second. But yeah, we have a lot of interesting questions about animals and sound again in general. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say, I was Googling, I actually found different answers than Christian. I found something that said birds tend to have narrower hearing range than humans, but Christian thinks the opposite. So we will definitely explore this in a future episode.
I don't think the opposite. It's more ignorance. Look, I don't have much knowledge. I was just thinking of bats and the whole thing, and I said, well, if you take them all together, but that's not the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, a couple of general things on how animals use sound. So basically, the higher frequency the sound, the more the sound is going to bounce back, which is why bats like to use it for echolocation, right? But it's the bad thing about that bouncing back of the sound is then it doesn't travel as far. So, for example, elephants have a very low, ultra low frequency sounds that they make to send communications off to other elephants. And they're these very low rumblings. And these low rumblings, they don't bounce back. They just travel for miles and miles so that other elephants can hear them. And so this is like
drums do, right? Drums are low frequency. That's how they used to communicate. So that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we can see that, like, based on the properties of sound, like once you kind of understand the basics of how it's working, you can start to think about, okay, well, what might different animals be able to hear, or what types of sounds might they make? And so birds are often using sound for sort of similar reasons that humans do. We're trying to just talk to each other. They're trying to talk to other birds that are pretty nearby oftentimes. This is my territory. Would anyone out there like to mate with me? Those kinds of things.
Or get the hell out of here. That's another
one.
Get
the heck out of here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we got a lot of interesting questions. I can just say that I have actually, and that's coming later in the interview, there are some experts, and that's what David Houghton was also interested in songbirds in cities. That's something that I've been interested in. And I'll bring up the question in a moment. It's amazing that David anticipated it. I just wanted to say I have written to a biologist, and hopefully we can get her to talk about this in the future. Anyway, Georgia, go ahead. So
a couple interesting things. And I realized we didn't touch on James Bourne, Gentleman's Ghost comment about if birds can hear wind turbines. So I hadn't heard of that. Wind turbines, some people complain that they make a very high-pitched kind of noise that's above human hearing. But I haven't heard that birds can hear them. But it might be true. There's so many species of bird. Some species might be able to hear them. I've also heard rumors that people with hearing implants are bothered by the sound of wind turbines more so sometimes. But it's always hard to say, because almost like some people really don't like when wind turbines come up in their community. And so they almost starts to be like weird rumors, or like things just pop up sometimes that are not necessarily, it's hard to tell what's true and what's not true sometimes. There was, oh man, there was
Well, I'm
something
going to
else.
make a note of that. I find it a very interesting topic. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to look more into
Mhm.
that too. Yeah.
Mhm. Shall we continue, Georgia?
Yeah, I think we're good to continue the interview.
Okay, go on. Let's go.
Because things are changing so rapidly, we can't get a baseline recording of something that we can rely on.
It's already so disrupted.
It's so disrupted that, and so we're looking for a new term, a new word, a new way to express these alpha recordings that we're getting, and this data that we're beginning to collect in the field, because it no longer is reliable in terms of its dynamic equilibrium of expression. So you have to figure out a new way to look at this data. And it's really, to me, it's pretty distressing because I'm not sure how to deal with it.
Yeah, you're bringing up something that's so obvious. I've sat for hundreds of hours out on what was wilderness shorelines, just listening to this total soundscape, and you would hear your eagle's call, but you would not hear a bulldozer, you would not hear a boat. But nowadays, where do you go? That you don't hear a jet plane going over the bulldozers and everything as part of the background, but not just them being part of the background, but now I'm even more sensitive to what has their passage over or eliminated in the rest of the natural soundscape. How many species have shut up for some period of time because
we're changed because the migration patterns are changing now. I've spent a lot of time in BC. I've worked in Vancouver Island, both the east and west side of Vancouver Island, south of Tofino, and also in Johnstone Strait, recording killer whales.
So you know Helen and Paul Spong.
Yeah, of course I know Paul Spong, and that was the site that I recorded killer whales at in the late 70s. So I did a lot of my early research there. And I have to tell you that my wife Kat and I were just there in Tofino, and I went just south in one of the preserved forests to record several mornings, and it's really quiet now. It's very much more quiet than when I first went there. The forest is still there, but because these are biological islands and it's logged all around it, and some of it is secondary growth, the whole biophony has changed, and it's kind of frightening to me. It's kind of like a Stephen King novel. When I go back there, I mean, the narrative, I think of these soundscapes as narratives of place, and they give us a lot of information. And when I go back there now, that narrative has changed so radically that it kind of makes me sad. And I don't know how, I kind of am psychologically affected by the loss of this material, especially when I compare now what I had, in 40 years ago with what I've got now.
When you were out there south of Tofino, were you in Barkley Sound?
Yeah.
I spent 4 years doing my thesis in Barkley Sound during the early 60s. I know Barkley Sound like the palm of my hand. I mean, it was my place of being for 4 years.
It was a wonderful place, and I can't remember the name of the place, Wickaninnish Lodge or something.
Yeah, Wickaninnish Inn, that's the national park.
Right, and so we were there in 1968, maybe 69. That was the first time I went there. So yeah, I know that area really well, and I love BC. I saw a lot of BC before it was logged and destroyed. Same thing with Vancouver Island, and And it's changed a lot. And I don't, I really don't quite know what to do with it. I've been talking with a lot of researchers. Jane Goodall is a person we spent a lot of time with in Gombe, working at her site. And I'm saying to her, she's 86 years old, and she's a few years older than me, and I'm saying to her, how do you keep doing this? She said, I don't go back to Gombe much anymore because it's too depressing. She said, but I'm still hopeful. I'm hopeful because of young kids doing stuff. I said, Dana, I need an infusion of hope here. She says to me, you just keep doing it,
Bernie, I have an interesting example that really surprised me. I spent time in Germany because I grew up there partly. And I was there last July, and I was surprised in the morning when you open the windows how many songbirds there are in the middle of Stuttgart. Now, this shocked me because when I take my dogs for a walk, even our neighborhood, I hardly hear any songbirds. How is that possible? Nobody's been able to answer to me, give me an answer that you hear so many songbirds in the middle of a city.
Well, the birds, the urban birds have a way of survival that is mysterious to all of us. There are a lot of people doing research on that. Nadia Peretti at the University of Urbino in Italy is doing work on urban songbirds, and she's come up with some remarkable answers. If you're looking for an answer,
I am. I'd love to know.
She's certainly one who can help you with that.
Okay.
And this is research beyond the Italians putting every small bird in a pie.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. These are the ones that survive.
I was just going to say very quickly on the note of urban soundbirds. I mean, no secret. I think we know quite well now. Some species just do really well in cities. Raccoons, opossums, things like that. And some species of birds do really well in cities, like robins. And so there's a lot of research on like what makes a good city species. Is it something that's a generalist? We know it's definitely not the species of birds that eat insects, that rely heavily on insects, because you want the ones that are willing to go after those breadcrumbs and stuff and cracker crumbs. But an interesting sound thing that I have noticed about urban birds is that sometimes in the evening you will hear, for example, a very loud robin or just a very loud bird doing its evening call, and it's echoing. You realize, oh, it's so loud because it's echoing. It's in a particular corner of some buildings, or it's in a parking structure or something where its call is just reverberating. And I was with one of my friends once who she is an ornithologist. She studies birds. And I said, I wonder, do you think they know on purpose? Do you think that they pick the spot where like their voice like echoes and is projected by the buildings really well to make their call louder? And she said, a lot of bird people talk about that. A lot of people think that they probably do seek out these spots in cities sometimes where they know they can tell, oh, my voice is really loud here. It's like a big amphitheater. But she said a lot of bird biologists suspect that birds kind of know this and will do it, at least some individuals. But I don't think anyone studied it. It's actually a really hard thing to study. You can't go to the bird and interview it and say, hey, are you doing this on purpose? Like, do you know what you're doing? But that's something, if you walk around cities now and you look for that or you listen for that, you will notice it eventually.
I think actually Nadia Piretti, whom Bernie was referring to, I just had a bit of time to look at her literature. That's also why I wrote to her, if she's interested in an interview, has studied such things. So yeah, it's difficult to study, and it'll be very interesting to hear more about it. I found what you said absolutely fascinating. So it's like sitting at the right place in a concert theater where you get heard everywhere, right? Or an amphitheater. That's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely something to keep an ear out for when next time you're walking around a city.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That may be the answer. I never thought about that. It's good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, shall we continue?
Yeah, back to the interview. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I always am amazed from the history. the history that is continuing today, they still try to kill and eat every little damn songbird. I mean, it's unbelievable about the Italian culture. So how she's finding specimens in Italy is beyond me.
There's even more, David, because the European Union, I went to give a talk there a couple of years ago in Brussels, and the European Union is looking at preserving all of the remaining old-growth forests that exist across the EU and the 28 countries of the EU. And I have some really wonderful recordings of, for instance, Christian, the Black Forest, that were done by a colleague of mine, Volker Wittmann. He went and recorded there. It's one of our best-selling albums, as a matter of fact, on our website. It's really a beautiful piece of work. We've got stuff from Chernobyl. We've got stuff, beautiful recordings from Chernobyl.
Let me interject. My guess is you've never had anything, if you've collected it over time, that had such a marvelous improvement as Chernobyl. I mean, it went from such a disaster to being now, in many ways, probably the highlight of variability of the bios.
David, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
The guy that recorded that is, trying to think, Peter Cusack from the UK. And he went there in 2006, 20 years after the disaster. And what he found was remarkable. I mean, he had wolves and bear and all kinds of birds and cuckoos and stuff like that were marvelous. And the biophony looks very healthy. I mean, to our ear and to my ear, it sounds great. To the eye, and because we can't spend a lot of time there, obviously, it's a site that's completely abandoned. But it's coming back. If we leave things the hell alone, actually can recover a little bit. And this is a perfect example of that. The Black Forest is another example. But there are other places. I mean, we recorded all around, not just in southern Germany below Munich, but about 50 kilometers south of Munich. And we got really nice recordings. It's not, the density and diversity isn't there because there's too much farming and agriculture around it, and who knows what's being put into the soil. But the basic material is there, I think, and I think with some time and some care, it could really come back.
Did you go in the spring when the capercaillie and the black grouse were calling?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a highlight on that.
Well, we were there in May, so it was like from May 7th, from May 11th through May 18th recording. So yeah, we got that. So anyway,
do you ever take a camera along? I'm just curious. Never.
I don't see.
That's remarkable. Yes. Well, with cameras, you don't actually.
The few slides that I had were lost in the fire because I hadn't transferred the slides. I mean, I had a couple of slides from Africa and things like that, and everything is gone. All the visual stuff is gone.
Is it that you don't see color, or what is it? I'm just curious.
I don't see, period. I mean, I just don't see very well. You never want to drive with me. Especially on the Autobahn. Yeah. I'm a 200-kilometer driver.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Well, you're defining your hazards and apparently your risks as well.
Yeah. It's a very nice example.
It's not David.
That was Bernie Krause. I hope you enjoyed that. So,
Yeah, that was great to listen to. I mean, he
mhm.
has accomplished so much in his life, like musically and scientifically. And it's, soundscape ecology really has become a huge, um, like sort of fundamental pillar of how we do biology now. And people are using it more and more in conservation and all these things. And so it's really cool to hear about his experience with kind of with the inception of it, basically, towards the beginning. Yeah.
You know what I always find remarkable about such really successful people who've gone very far, if you listen how they got there, is, and I learned this actually from a very famous musician, a friend of mine. He said, Christian, when I reach out my arm, I always try to go further than my arm can reach. And that's the same mentality you have with Bernie and David Hancock and many others. And it's something that you can remember for your life. It's remarkable how he overcame his fear. His fear of going out. I just love it, really.
That was amazing to hear. Yeah, I mean,
Mm,
because so many students
mm,
that I work with and other
mm.
people, they are scared to be on a hiking
Yeah,
trail. Like he joked,
yeah,
he went out and there was signs everywhere. And I know that nature
mm,
area he's talking about. It's not
yeah.
like it does. It's like a park. It's very well, good trails, all this, and that was very intimidating to him. And so yeah, to see how far he's gone with it is just so cool. I think yeah, pushing outside of your comfort zone is great.
And he was also University of Michigan, wasn't he? As far as I
Yes.
understood, right? Ann
Yeah,
Arbor.
yeah, he said he was there.
Yeah,
Where I just
interesting.
left from there actually a few days ago. So forever.
That's why it looks different now. I see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, there we
Um,
go.
but
Okay.
anyway, so my final, I guess, comment to everyone would be if you are interested in contributing as a citizen scientist
Mhm.
to this sort of soundscape ecology resource, there is actually an app on your smartphone that you can use to contribute
Oh,
to this.
oh, wow.
So it's called Record the Earth. I just downloaded
Record the
it, and
earth.
basically
Hang
you
on.
make a recording and you let it go for 20 seconds or something. This one I won't end up submitting, but when you're done with the recording, you can write in like what you heard. I'll just say test, so you can choose your own description, and then it also has some more guided questions like, did you hear insects? Did you hear, you just sort of
Really?
check it on and you go next. And then, what weather items did you hear? Rain, wind, etc.
Is
Next.
that right? That's
What
great.
kind of noises from the human environment did you hear?
Hmm.
Traffic, etc. And so this is a really cool way for you to, I guess, contribute to our kind of knowledge on
I
how
love it. I love
sound
it.
is
That's great.
changing over time. Yeah.
Is that both you know whether it's both on the iPhone and Android or
I
probably
think it is. I'm on Android, but I
okay
believe that it is in both.
in both?
And I
I'll
know,
check it out.
yeah, it's called Record the Earth, and it's
Hmm,
associated with a soundscape ecology lab at Purdue University. Yeah.
incredible. Well, thank you for that, George.
Yeah.
That's really
Hmm.
interesting.
Yeah.
So let's jump to next week. So next week it's Jack Molan, and it's all about eagles and the illusions. So he's an author also, and so going to jump right back into the wild world of eagles.
I'm so excited for it. Yeah, I can't wait.
And thank you, everyone.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, real quick. David Howden says he's also been using an audio moth device to try and record
oh,
nocturnal migration. Yeah.
audio moth device.
Something a little bit more professional perhaps, but yeah, there are also other apps you can get. So the Wildlife Acoustics makes a bat
Okay.
detector that, because most microphones are designed for sounds within the human range of hearing, not
Mhm,
sounds above that, like
mhm.
bat calls, you have to get it's a special little microphone that plugs in, and you can identify bat calls on your phone with that, but that's specific to bats. um, and yeah, and I don't know what audio if audio moth is something similar or different, but there's all kinds of things out there. I encourage you to
Amazing,
check it out.
amazing.
Yeah, tell us what you'll find. All
Yeah.
right, bye everyone so much. Thank you for joining. If you liked what you heard, definitely make sure that you like and subscribe wherever you're
Yeah.
watching this. We do this every Wednesday. We do the Humans and Wildlife show, Wednesdays 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time in North America.
That's it. Thank you very much, everyone, and good